In 1485, 17 years after his death, a legal code was completed in the name of the Joseon dynasty. It was called the Gyeongguk Daejeon, the National Code, a systematic collection of laws governing every level of Korean society: administrative ranks, criminal penalties, land registration, military service, ritual procedure, the conduct of court ceremony, the obligations of local officials, the rights of common subjects. It had been in preparation for decades, refined and revised across successive reigns, and when it was finally promulgated, it became the constitutional foundation of the Joseon state. For more than 4 centuries, through invasions and famines and dynastic crises, it governed the kingdom. The language changed slowly, institutions evolved, but the Gyeongguk Daejeon remained the document against which all other laws were measured. It was, in the most literal sense, the operating system of Korean civilization across nearly 500 years. The man who initiated that project, who commissioned its early compilation, who reorganized Joseon's military and administrative systems from the ground up, who translated Buddhist scriptures and built temples and left behind a governing framework that outlasted him by generations, was King Sejo, the 7th ruler of Joseon. He was also the man who deposed his teenage nephew, had 6 loyal ministers executed in one of the most publicly brutal ceremonies in the dynasty's history, sent the boy who had been king to die alone in a mountain exile, and silenced a generation of scholars who could not bring themselves to serve him. Those 2 facts belong to the same person. This is the problem with Sejo. He does not resolve cleanly. The villain of The King's Warden, the film that brought his era back into Korean conversation, is also the architect of the state that the film's characters inhabit. The man who made the kingdom function was the man who broke it open to take it. Korea has spent 5.5 centuries deciding how to feel about him and has not entirely finished. History tends to prefer its figures in one register: a tyrant or a builder, a criminal or a statesman. Sejo resists that preference at every angle. He was both. He knew he was both, and he spent the last 13 years of his reign trying to govern inside that knowledge without being consumed by it. This is not a story about forgiving him or condemning him. The historical record does not require either. It requires something harder: holding what he built and what he did in the same frame, without letting either erase the other. That is where Sejo has always lived, in the space between the law he wrote and the blood he shed to sit at the desk where he wrote it. Understanding him requires sitting in that space without rushing to either exit. To understand Sejo, it helps to begin with his father. Sejong the Great is the figure most Koreans name when asked to name their greatest king. The creator of Hangul, the patron of scientific inquiry who oversaw instruments for measuring rainfall, stars, and time. The ruler who built an institution of scholars dedicated to research and innovation. The king who governed with something approaching genuine care for what happened to ordinary people under his administration. Sejong's reign is the benchmark against which other Joseon kings are measured, and most fall short. Sejo was Sejong's 2nd surviving son. Growing up as the 2nd son in that particular shadow had its consequences. His elder brother Moonjong was the heir, scholarly and deliberate, and temperamentally suited to the patient, text-centered style of kingship their father modeled. Sejo, born EU in 1417 and titled Prince Suyang on his coming of age, was shaped differently. He was physically strong, drawn to military matters, aggressive in the way that capable second sons sometimes are, when the expectations directed at the first son leave the second one with something to prove, and no obvious arena to prove it in. He was also, by the testimony of people who observed him closely, genuinely capable in ways that went beyond ambition. Sejong used him. When Joseon needed a commanding presence for military campaigns against the Jurchen tribes along the northern frontier, Suyang went. When there were diplomatic situations requiring someone who projected royal authority rather than bureaucratic deference, Soo-young could be counted on. He accumulated across decades the kind of experience that the heir, carefully managed and kept close to the palace and its rituals, did not. By the time he was in his mid-30s, he had commanded troops, managed complex negotiations, and developed the confidence of a man who had been tested outside the controlled environment of court ceremony. This matters for understanding what came later. When Sejong moved to seize power, he did not do so as a man overreaching. He did so as a man who had spent 30 years developing genuine competence in exactly the domains that kingship required. His coup was not the desperate act of someone who felt himself slipping into irrelevance. It was the calculated act of someone who had decided that his qualifications entitled him to what his birth position had not. Whether that belief was correct is a different question from whether it was sincere. It appears to have been sincere. Moonjong succeeded Sejong in 1450, but he was already ill when he took the throne, visibly fragile, and died 2 years later. He left behind a son who would be called Danjong, who was 11 years old at his father's death, by Western count, 12 in the Korean traditional reckoning. The boy became king. The structural problem of a child king in a court full of powerful, ambitious ministers was not unique to Joseon. It has produced coups across dynasties in every civilization that has tried hereditary monarchy. The question is always the same: who actually governs when the king cannot? And the answer is always contested among the people positioned to answer it. The chief minister Kim Jong-se was the most powerful figure at court. He had served Sejong and Moonjong with loyalty and competence, and commanded enormous respect across the bureaucracy. He was also, in Prince Soo-young's assessment, a man accumulating influence over a king too young to check it, consolidating a position that would eventually make the monarchy itself secondary to the minister who managed it. That assessment may have been accurate. It may also have been the rationalization of a man who wanted power and needed a reason to take it that he could live with. Probably both were true at once. Most acts of political violence contain an honest grievance alongside a self-serving one. The difficulty is that the person committing the act rarely has the clarity or the interest to separate them. In the 10th month of 1453, Prince Soo-young moved. The events of that night and the days that followed, the killing of Kim Jong-soo, the removal of officials who might have organized resistance, the rapid consolidation of power around Soo-young himself, are documented in detail that belongs to a different telling. The story of what it cost Danjong is not this story. What matters here is the psychology. What did Soo-young tell himself before he acted? And what did he do with those arguments in the years that followed? He told himself that Kim Jong-soo was a genuine danger, that a minister who effectively controlled a child king was building a power base that would eventually dwarf the throne itself. This was not an invented concern. Korean and Chinese dynastic history offered many examples of what happened when ministers outgrew the kings they nominally served. The outcomes were rarely stable and rarely ended well for anyone, including the ministers. He told himself that he was the most qualified man available, that Danjong at 12 and at 13 and at 14 was not capable of independent governance, and that the men surrounding him were shaping his perceptions in ways that would make independent governance unlikely, even when age might otherwise have permitted it. Someone with actual capacity had to hold the state together. Soo-young had spent 30 years accumulating exactly the competence that the role required. He told himself that what he was doing was necessary, that necessity and legal legitimacy were not always the same thing, but that sometimes the necessary thing had to be done regardless of whether the forms had been followed. The question of whether he believed these arguments, or whether he deployed them as cover for something simpler, is one the record cannot fully answer. What is clear is that he did not act impulsively. The coup was prepared carefully over months, organized with attention to timing and personnel, executed at a moment Soo-young had chosen rather than one forced on him. This was the work of a man who had thought about what he was doing. Kim Jong-soo was killed the night of the coup. Danjong, 12 years old, was left on the throne for another 2 years, while Soo-young consolidated his position as the power behind the young king. In 1455, Danjong abdicated. Whether that abdication was freely given or produced under conditions that made refusal unthinkable, the historical record notes with careful ambiguity. Soo-young became King Sejo. For a year the new arrangement held, without the confrontation that might have defined it. Then came 1456. A group of officials, men who had served at court before and after the abdication, organized an attempt to assassinate Sejo at a royal banquet and restore Danjong. The plot was discovered before it could be carried out. The conspirators were arrested. 6 of them, men who would be remembered collectively as the Sayukshin, the 6 martyred ministers, refused to yield, refused to name additional conspirators, refused to perform the acts of submission that might have softened their sentences. The executions that followed were conducted in public by methods designed for maximum consequence. Not just the 6 men but their families, wives, children, parents, siblings, relatives connected by degrees that the law treated as close enough, were killed or distributed as slaves. The records preserve the specific names and fates because the Joseon court kept meticulous records of everything, including this. Sejo ordered all of it. After 1456, the argument that he had acted to protect the kingdom from ministerial overreach became significantly harder to hold alongside what the kingdom had watched him do. The necessity he had invoked had produced a ledger that necessity alone could not balance. Danjong was exiled to Yeongwol in the eastern mountains. In 1457, he died there. He was 17 years old. The specific cause was recorded with the same diplomatic imprecision that surrounded his abdication. Sejo was 39. He had 14 more years ahead of him. What he did with them is the rest of the story. The executions of the Sayukshin produced a particular kind of silence across Joseon's scholarly class. Not all of it was the silence of fear, though fear was certainly present and rational. Some of it was the deliberate silence of men who had decided, each in his own way, that there were things they would not do regardless of the personal cost of refusing. The figure who came to represent that choice most visibly was not one of the 6 who died. It was a man who refused to die, and refused, with equal stubbornness, to live the way Sejo wanted him to. Kim Si-seup was 21 years old when the Sayukshin were executed. He had been regarded as a prodigy since childhood, educated to a level that would have made him valuable to any court. His future in government considered more or less certain by everyone who knew him. When news of the executions reached him, he burned his books. He took Buddhist vows and became a wandering monk, traveling between mountain temples across the country. He spent the rest of his life as someone who had refused to participate in the Sejo regime, not by fighting it, but by simply stepping out of the world it controlled. He became one of the Sangyukshin, the 6 living loyalists, men who expressed their refusal through absence rather than through the kind of direct resistance that ended in execution. In Korean historical memory, both the Sayukshin who died and the Sangyukshin who withdrew have been honored, though for different reasons and in different registers. The martyred 6 are honored for what they attempted. Kim Si-seup and his counterparts are honored for what they refused. Sejo understood the weight of both kinds of resistance. A court staffed by men who served him because they had calculated that serving was safer than refusing was not the same as a court that believed in what he was building. The administrative talent he needed to actually govern, scholars who could draft complex legislation, officials who understood the detailed mechanics of land tenure and military logistics and ritual protocol, was drawn from the same scholarly class that had the strongest reasons to regard his presence on the throne as a crime rather than a mandate. He could not manufacture loyalty that was not there. What he could do was create conditions in which capable people found it tolerable, or at least possible, to continue working within the system. He could make the work itself meaningful enough that the question of who had authorized it receded behind the substance of what was being accomplished. Whether this succeeded depends on what you are measuring. If you are measuring whether talented people continued to staff the Joseon government during Sejo's reign, the answer is yes. If you are measuring whether the Joseon scholarly community resolved its moral discomfort with the coup and what followed, the answer is that it never did. Not in his lifetime, not in subsequent reigns, not in the way Korean history has continued to think about him ever since. The 6 ministers who died resisting him are commemorated today at a site in Seoul, their names carved into a memorial that visitors still come to read. Their monument exists within a city that still runs, at some institutional remove, on governing systems Sejo designed. Children learn about both the Sayukshin and the Gyeongguk Daejeon in the same history curriculum, without the curriculum explaining how to hold them simultaneously. It leaves that problem to the reader. That coexistence has never been resolved. It simply persists, the way difficult historical truths persist when neither side of them can be honestly eliminated. When erasing the crime would falsify the record, and erasing the achievement would falsify it in a different direction. The Joseon dynasty that Sejo inherited in 1455 was 60 years old. Its founding institutions had been established by Daejeon and refined under Danjong and Sejong, and they were functional, but incomplete. The legal framework that was supposed to govern the kingdom systematically did not yet exist in codified form. Laws had accumulated by precedent, by royal decree, by administrative custom, producing a body of governance that was functional but inconsistent, and that left room for interpretation which powerful officials could exploit in ways that undermined the authority of the throne. Sejo set about changing this. The project that would produce the Gyeongguk Daejeon began during his reign. He commissioned the systematic compilation of Joseon's accumulated laws, pulling together precedents from 6 decades of governance into a coherent, organized framework. The work was not completed in his lifetime. His grandson Sungjong promulgated the final version in 1485, but the conceptual architecture, the organizational structure, and the administrative logic that made it possible were products of Sejo's reign and the officials he put to work on the problem. When the Gyeongguk Daejeon was finished, it governed Joseon for more than 400 years. It specified how officials were appointed and what they were responsible for. It regulated how land was registered, measured, and taxed. It defined criminal procedures and the hierarchy of penalties. It structured military service obligations. It codified ritual ceremonies. It was, in the most literal sense possible, the operating system of the Joseon state, and it was running on the architecture Sejo had commissioned. Beyond the legal code, he reorganized the military in ways that centralized command and reduced the influence of private patronage networks in military appointments. He restructured the system of land grants to soldiers, tying military service more directly to royal authority than to the favor of powerful families. These reforms were not uniformly popular. They displaced interests that had long been accustomed to their position, but they produced a more coherent and more directly state-controlled military establishment. He also expanded Gyeongguk Daejeon, the office for translating and printing Buddhist texts. Under his patronage, major Buddhist scriptures were translated into Korean and printed in editions that made them accessible beyond the small community of scholars who read classical Chinese. He built Wongaksa Temple in the capital, at the site where a pagoda still stands today. He visited remote mountain monasteries and maintained relationships with Buddhist teachers in ways that put him consistently at odds with the Confucian orthodoxy of his court. This combination, systematic legal codification, military centralization, Buddhist cultural patronage, represented a vision of governance that was more pragmatic than ideological. Sejo did not seem particularly interested in whether his policies fit neatly into the Confucian framework that was supposed to structure Joseon kingship. He was interested in whether they worked. What drove this volume of output? The historical record cannot answer that question directly, but the pattern across 13 years of reign is suggestive. A king whose legitimacy had been contested from the moment he took the throne, who had witnessed what happened when powerful men decided that a ruler was not worth serving, had strong practical reasons to make himself indispensable, to create things that would be difficult to dismantle, to make the state function in ways that made his continued presence at its center feel necessary rather than merely tolerated. That calculation, if it was a calculation, would also explain the urgency. He worked fast. The administrative output of his reign is, relative to its length, remarkable. Whatever was driving him, it was not complacency. In the later years of his reign, Sejo developed a chronic skin condition. The historical records describe it with the clinical imprecision of the period: sores on his back, eruptions that spread, persistent discomfort that the royal medical establishment could not reliably treat. He traveled to mountain temples, seeking relief that the palace could not provide. He visited Wongaksa on Mount Ode in the eastern mountains, a Buddhist monastery set high enough that the air was different from the capital, and spent extended periods there. The condition never resolved. In Korean tradition, the connection between Sejo's disease and Danjong has been made consistently since his own lifetime. The skin that would not heal was the body's account of what the soul had done. Whether this is understood as supernatural judgment, as the psychopathosomatic expression of guilt that had nowhere else to go, or simply as the narrative shape that a culture placed around a coincidence, the tradition has been remarkably stable across 5 centuries. The king who caused that much suffering did not escape it entirely. The damage he had done to others found a corresponding expression in him. The stories that gather around Wongaksa are specific in the way that meaningful legends tend to be. One account holds that while Sejo was bathing in a mountain stream near the monastery, a child appeared and helped wash his back, reaching the places where the sores were worst, the places he could not reach himself. When Sejo asked the child not to tell anyone that he had washed the back of the king, the child replied that Sejo should likewise not tell anyone that he had seen a bodhisattva. In this telling, Sejo was being tended by something that had no particular reason to extend grace to him, extending it anyway, not because he had earned it, but because grace does not always wait for earning. Another story holds that a cat woke Sejo from sleep at the monastery, disturbing him before an assassin could complete an approach. He spared the cat. This detail, a king who had ordered the deaths of ministers and their families, moved by a cat in the dark, to an act of mercy, has lodged in Korean memory as one of those inexplicable small graces that human beings extend when the large moral architecture of their lives has become too heavy to navigate directly. These stories do not settle Sejo's account. They do something more interesting. They show a tradition finding ways to hold a complicated person without resolving the complication, reaching for the small and the oblique rather than for verdict or absolution. The bodhisattva did not tell him he was forgiven. The cat did not undo the executions. The stories simply sit alongside everything else, refusing to be the final word. Sejo's Buddhist patronage intensified through these later years, in ways that went beyond the political patronage that any powerful ruler might extend to institutions seeking royal favor. He was personally engaged with the texts, with the translations, with the specific problems of making complex doctrinal material comprehensible to Korean readers. This level of involvement is difficult to explain as purely political theater. Something genuine appears to have been happening, even if we cannot say precisely what. He died in 1468, at 50. His reign had lasted 13 years. Danjong had been dead for 11 of them. The mountain monastery at Wongaksa still receives visitors. The stream where the legend places the bodhisattva is still there. Whether what Sejo was looking for in those mountains was resolution, relief, or simply the specific quality of attention that distance from the court allowed, the record does not say. What it preserves is the image of a king spending his last years in the mountains, still carrying something that 13 years of governance had not put down. The king's warden renders Sejo as background, a force that shapes everything while appearing directly almost not at all. The film is about the cost of living under him, not about the cost of being him. That framing is its own kind of argument. The villain made peripheral to the suffering he caused, which is one way of saying that the suffering was more important than his reasons for producing it. The historical Sejo might not have entirely disagreed with that assessment, though he would have had more to say. His official posthumous title, granted by the court after his death, carries connotations of achievement through difficulty, not ease, but persistence through opposition and complication. Whether the officials who composed that title were being generous, accurate, diplomatically evasive, or some mixture of all three, the choice of emphasis is telling. The court that lived inside the institutions he built found the language of difficult achievement more apt than the language of simple condemnation or simple praise. What the record does answer, with unusual clarity for a period this remote, is that Sejo was genuinely substantial in both directions. The violence was real and it was large. The coup removed a child from a throne he had inherited. The executions after 1456 destroyed not just men who had organized resistance, but their families, people who had done nothing except exist in proximity to men Sejo needed to be examples. The exile of a 17-year-old who then died there was real, whatever the specific circumstances of that death. And the Gyeongguk Daejeon was real. The military reforms were real. The Buddhist translations survive. The administrative systems he reorganized formed the institutional skeleton of a dynasty that lasted until 1897. These were not trivial accomplishments, and they were not accidents. The problem that Sejo poses is the problem of the ruler who does terrible things and governs well, which is more common in history than the tidy moral universe of good rulers and bad rulers would suggest. History has a tendency to want practical failure to accompany moral failure, to want the tyrant to also be incompetent, because that makes the categories easier to use. Sejo declines that service. He was competent in ways that mattered for centuries after he was dead, and his competence was built on a foundation of violence that the centuries have not neutralized. Kim Si-seup, who walked away from the court and lived as a monk rather than serve a king he could not accept, represents one honest response to Sejo's existence. The 6 martyred ministers who organized resistance and were executed for it represent another. The officials who stayed and built the national code with him represent a third. None of them were wrong about which part of Sejo they were looking at. They were responding to different facets of a person who was genuinely all of those things simultaneously. This is the position that Sejo occupies in Korean memory. Not forgiven, not fully condemned. Present in the legal and institutional fabric of a civilization that would rather his story were simpler. He is buried on a hillside outside Seoul, in a tomb that the state still maintains. The national code he commissioned, in its evolved and adapted forms, runs through the DNA of institutions that govern South Korea today. And Danjong is buried in the eastern mountains where he died, in a tomb that the state also maintains, because both of them are, in their different ways, inescapable. Some questions are not meant to close. The distance between those two tombs is part of the answer.